I'm an artist, born in the mid 60s. I started doing my art, or rather, if I was to start with my art journey, it started in lower primary school, where then it was more of a hobby because my English teacher, who was specifically our class teacher, would always pick myself and another student, his name was Mwangi, to do the charts whenever we had any chart work to be done regarding the schoolwork, especially for English and CRE. That was Christian Religious Education. Then we would be picked to do the charts. Simultaneously, at this particular point in time, my cousin, who is a sculptor, the late Charles Carroll Bwire, was living with us. My dad brought him up, he educated him, and so we used to live in the same house. And he was, of course, elder to me because he was already a practicing artist and sculptor. And so I picked up my art just by observing what he was doing. I would always hang around him when he was working. And that's how I generally got into the art world. As I moved on with my education, especially for my secondary school and high school, I was not able to access any art facilities, especially in school. And those days, our parents, of course, wanting better things for us, would guide us into mostly science subjects. And so I focused more on science subjects. But I remember having a stint in my first form and second form where I studied a little bit of metal work and woodwork. I used to love those lessons because they used to bring out some creativity in me. But after third form, I focused more on science subjects. In fact, for my high school, I did physics, chemistry, and biology as my combination. Now, after school, or after finishing our secondary education, we used to be out for 2 years because then the system was a bit slow in absorbing the university graduates or undergraduates. So we used to be out for 2 years, and that gave us an opportunity to get into working spaces. And so I was lucky in that one of my neighbors was working for an advertising company. And so I got a job with communication graphics where I joined as a trainee illustrator. And so I got now to pick up my artwork. But this was more of commercial arts and graphics. From there, I took an initiative to learn art now formally. And this I did at then Kenya Polytechnic. It has now transformed into a full-fledged university. That is TUK. And this is where now I would go in the evening. I used to take evening classes to further my education in the arts. From communication graphics, I moved to another advertising company called Beasley Advertising, where I now was a bit more comfortable to work as an illustrator. I also had a stint with Cool Graphics. This was more in pre-print production and printing supervision. I am mentioning all these aspects of my life because I did know that eventually these dots were going to add up, because there are a lot of graphics that I am now able to use, or some experiences that I got from the advertising and illustrating work. And I am now able to directly use those experiences or those techniques to better my art.
How can you describe your artwork?
Yes, I am more of a realism artist. My, especially drawings or sculpture, focus more on realism art, and not just realism, but I like also, especially on the sculpture aspect, I like to give a bit of storied or themed sculptures. And so I like that when a client or any other art collector or interested party, whenever they view my sculpture, I would like them to be able to just read a story directly from that.
That's interesting. One thing I find interesting about your artwork is the way you capture Kenyan stories, especially stories that took place in the past, Kenyan history.
Yes.
And I would like you to tell us more about the Man-Eater's trophies, because it is one of the most amazing sculptures I've gotten to see so far.
Thank you very much. The Man-Eaters of Tsavo come, in fact, I would say coming directly because of the fact that I moved into the Railway Museum, where we have an art studio. And in this art studio, we have a lot of visitors coming in and out. And when you go to our main museum, we have a problem, because I thought the Man-Eater story is the most interesting story about the building of the meter gauge, which started in 1896 to 1901. But the Man-Eaters of Tsavo were actually the biggest impediment, I would say, because they managed to halt the construction of the railway for a good number of weeks. I think 3 to 4 weeks. The railway did not proceed because there were these two lions that developed a peculiar taste for human flesh. And so they kept raiding and stealing and eating the workers, the Indian coolies who were working on the railway. But when you get into the museum, the most interesting thing is that we do not have proper depiction of the lions, because they were sold to the Field Museum in Chicago, all the way in the US of A. And so when people come in, they want to know, where are our lions? And so I did miniatures depicting that story of Man-Eaters of Tsavo, in the hope that the Kenya Railways management would pick it up and probably commission the life-size lions to be sculpted. And so I am still pursuing that line with the management.
Oh, That's amazing. So I was going through your artwork and I realized that it is a combine. It has influences from both Christianity and African history. I was wondering, what's the main aim of your work? What does your work want to say?
Thank you. I am a born Catholic, and I was very, very much interested in going through the Catholic system of religion. And in my youth, we used to have a lot of Bible studies with my friends. I was at one point I was also a choir member in my neighborhood church. Now that background of having grown up in a Christian family has also been an influence in my artwork, in that when you did we used to have Christian religious education at school, they would come up with very interesting stories. I'm looking at stories like of Samson and Delilah. I'm looking at stories like David and Goliath. I'm looking at stories of Jesus Christ himself, because the chronology of events from when he was captured in the Garden of Gethsemane right up to when he was crucified on the cross at Golgotha, those stories tend to actually enliven my imagination, especially in sculpture. And so you find that my work is interspersed with, let me call them Christian stories, sculpture. Then I love to do human and animal anatomy studies. And also in the human anatomy studies, I like to depict, my artwork. I always give it a twist. I always like to see some action, especially in my sculpture. I find it very boring just to come up with maybe a human being standing. And so I always try to give my sculpture a story or a theme, if you like.
How long does it take you to create one sculpture?
Now, at this point in time, I think it is important for me to elaborate a little bit, because I do realism sculpture, but I take the casting form. Now, the cast sculpture has various stages, of which I would like to maybe bring out to help the viewer understand. Because a lot of people tend to confuse cast sculpture with carvings and maybe even curios. The difference is that cast sculpture, you make the sculpture. You can make the sculpture from plasticine. I prefer to use plasticine because this is a miniature form. But a lot other sculptors use clay. We have various forms of clays. Some are imported for specific purposes. But I prefer to use plasticine because these are miniatures and I'm able to get sufficient detail into them. Now, once the sculpture is done, then you move on to the mold, the master mold. The master mold is made from, in the inside, we have rubber.